What is striking about that period is not just the poverty itself, but what it did to him internally. Hunger has a way of leaving marks that money eventually covers but never fully erases. Even after he became one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood, that early desperation stayed with him. It shaped the way he saw success, as something fragile and temporary, something that could disappear as quickly as it had arrived. That underlying anxiety never fully went away, and it quietly colored everything that followed, from the choices he made in his career to the causes he devoted himself to later in life. His long-standing support for food charities and organizations focused on redistributing and used food was not simply a celebrity cause. It was personal memory dressed up as philanthropy. The turning point came when he landed the role in American Gigolo. Overnight, almost literally, the financial terror ended. He was paid around $350,000, along with share of future profits. And for the first time in his adult life, he did not have to calculate whether he could afford to eat. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of that success. Instead of relief settling into comfort, he found himself standing at the edge of something he had not anticipated. Fame arrived with a weight he had not prepared for, and the more it grew, the more uncomfortable he became beneath it. Films like An Officer and a Gentleman and Pretty Woman did not just make him successful. They turned him into a symbol, a projection of everything the public wanted to believe about romantic leading men. He was confident, magnetic, and completely in control, at least on screen. But behind that image, something very different was happening. He had carried a sense of alienation since his teenage years, a feeling of disconnection from the world around him that he could never fully explain or shake. Fame did not cure that disconnection. It amplified it. The more people watched him, analyzed him, and defined him by the characters he played, the more suffocated he felt. He later described his reaction to fame as that of a wild animal, instinctively pulling away from the trap rather than settling into it. So he made choices that Hollywood rarely forgives. Instead of chasing bigger roles and larger audiences, he began stepping back. He moved towards smaller films, character-driven projects, and work that aligned with his values rather than commercial expectations. He found Buddhism, and through it, began to redefine what success meant in terms that had nothing to do with box office returns or industry approval. To the outside world, it looked like an unusual career path. From the inside, it was a response to years of internal conflict that had finally become too loud to ignore. But pulling away from the machinery of Hollywood meant the machinery of Hollywood would eventually move on without him. And that is precisely what began to happen. Then came 1993, and the moment that quietly changed everything. Standing on the stage of the Academy Awards, in front of one of the largest television audiences in the world, Richard Gere did something almost no one in his position would have dared to do. He went off script. He used his time at the podium to speak about human rights abuses in China and call for Tibet's independence, directly addressing Chinese leadership in front of millions of viewers. It was not a vague or carefully worded statement designed to generate positive press. It was a deliberate act of conviction from a man who had already committed his life to that cause and was willing to accept whatever came next. What came next was significant, even if it unfolded quietly rather than dramatically. He was not officially blacklisted. There was no formal announcement, no public condemnation from the studios. But the pattern that followed was unmistakable. As Hollywood began increasingly relying on international audiences, particularly the massive and rapidly growing Chinese film market, Gere became a liability. He was permanently banned from entering China, which meant any major production that wanted access to that market had a compelling reason not to cast him. He later acknowledged this reality openly, admitting that his political views had made him a less desirable choice for the kinds of blockbuster projects that define mainstream Hollywood success. What makes this part of the story genuinely tragic is not that he suffered professionally. It is that he refused to undo the damage. He never walked back his statements. He never quietly distanced himself from the causes that had cost him so much. He accepted the trade-off with a kind of clarity that is rare in an industry built on image management and calculated survival. He continued to work, continued to find powerful roles, and his performance in Arbitrage earned him some of the strongest critical praise of his entire career. But the scale of what was available to him had permanently shifted. He had traded influence for integrity. And while that choice says something admirable about his character, The cost was real and lasting. His personal life during these same years was unfolding with its own kind of quiet devastation. His first high-profile marriage to Cindy Crawford had been rushed and unstable from the very beginning. Their wedding was spontaneous in a way that left Crawford herself feeling unsettled on the day it happened. The relationship existed under constant public scrutiny, with rumors and speculation following them wherever they went. Both denied the narratives that circulated about their motivations and their marriage, but the pressure of that constant examination, combined with genuinely different expectations and lifestyles, slowly pulled them apart. When the marriage ended, Gere described it as one of the most painful experiences of his life. Not just a divorce, but a public unraveling that forced him to sit with vulnerabilities he had spent years trying to keep private. There is something quietly devastating about watching a man who had everything slowly realize that everything was never quite enough. Richard Gere spent decades at the top of Hollywood, playing characters who radiated control, confidence, and charm. And for a long time, the world believed the image. But the truth behind that image is a story most people never got to see. A story about a man who was hungry before he was famous, isolated even when surrounded by millions of admirers, and who made choices that cost him dearly, not out of weakness, but out of conviction. At 75, looking back at the full arc of his life, what emerges is not a triumph. It is something far more complicated and far more heartbreaking. Before anyone knew his name, before the magazine covers and the blockbusters and the red carpets, Richard Gere was a young man in New York who could not afford to eat. This is not a metaphor. This is not the kind of romanticized struggle that actors describe in interviews to seem relatable. He was genuinely, desperately hungry during the 1970s while he was working in theater, including off-Broadway productions. The pay was so small that food became something he had to think carefully about every single day. Eggs were his primary meal because they were among the cheapest things he could buy. Restaurants were not a consideration. They belonged to a world he had not yet reached, and during those years, he was not sure he ever would. His second marriage to Carrie Lowell appeared more grounded at first. They shared a son, Homer, and for a period their life together seemed stable in ways his first marriage never had been. But beneath that surface, opposing preferences began to create widening distance. He gravitated toward isolation and quiet, while she remained connected to a more social and public way of living. When they separated, what followed was not a clean or quick resolution. The legal battle stretched across several years, centered around a financial dispute involving an estimated $45 million fortune. It was prolonged, exhausting, and painful in ways that went far beyond the financial stakes. For years, both of them remained tied to a process that prevented closure, forced to remain entangled in conflict even after the relationship itself was long over. During these same years, physical setbacks piled on top of the emotional ones. A horseback riding accident left him with a broken hand, and in one of the more revealing moments of his character, he walked home alone afterward rather than seeking help. While filming a fight scene, he refused to let a stunt performer take over, insisting on doing it himself despite clear risks, and ended up dislocating his shoulder and shutting down production for weeks. These were not isolated incidents. They reflected something deeper, a stubborn resistance to stepping back, even when stepping back would have been the sensible and self-protective choice. The same quality that made him willing to take career risks also made him unwilling to protect himself from physical ones. There was also the international controversy that erupted after an AIDS awareness event in India, where a gesture intended to promote health awareness led to charges of obscenity. Protests followed. The story spread quickly and widely. Although the charges were eventually dismissed, the episode added another layer of public turbulence to an already difficult period, and it underscored how easily good intentions could become complicated in a world where cultural and legal contexts collided without warning. As he moved into his later years, the losses became more intimate. His mother passed away at 91, and though he rarely spoke about grief in public, those who had followed his life understood what that loss represented. She had been one of the anchors of the stable, grounded upbringing he had always quietly hoped to recreate in his own life. Then his father passed away at 100, a man Gere had consistently described with deep admiration, someone who had approached his work and his community with a sense of genuine service and purpose. The The humanitarian values that had defined so much of Gere's adult life could be traced directly back to that influence. But with both parents gone, he was left carrying those values forward without the presence of people who had first given them to him. A hospitalization for pneumonia during a family trip served as another reminder of how little control any of us ultimately have over the body, regardless of how long we have managed to push through pain and difficulty without slowing down. The illness spread through his family, turning a celebration into a prolonged recovery. And while he regained his health, it was a kind of experience that changes the way a person looks at time. Yet within all of this, there is something that happened in his later years that feels less like conclusion and more like a quiet arrival. His marriage to Alejandra Silva brought a kind of stability that had genuinely eluded him for decades. It was not perfect, but it was grounded in shared values rather than external expectations, built slowly and intentionally rather than impulsively. Together, they created a blended family that included children from previous relationships and 2 sons of their own. Their decision to relocate to Spain was a deliberate move away from the world that had once defined him and towards something more private, more personal, and arguably more real. At 75, Richard Gere does not occupy the center of Hollywood the way he once did. He does not chase the kinds of roles that would put him back there. The hunger that defined his early years has long since been fed. The spiritual path he chose, at great professional cost, has remained a constant. The causes he fought for when it would have been far safer to stay silent have not been abandoned. And the family he spent so much of his life failing to hold together is finally, in this last chapter, taken a shape he can hold. That is not a tragedy in the conventional sense, but it is heartbreaking in a quieter and perhaps more honest way, because it shows what it actually costs to live according to your own values in a world that rewards performance over truth. Richard Gere gave up more than most people realize to become who he actually is. And at 75, the question is not whether you should have made different choices. The question is whether the rest of us would have had the courage to make the same ones